We meet today in freedom's cause and raise our voices high.
Hello, from the World Peace Forum in Vancouver. Today, we're happy to present two speakers. First, Andrew Marshall, who talks about the myths and powers of bankers, and also about the myths and cooptation of politicians. Let's listen to Andrew's dissertation, and after that, you can register your own opinion on nowpolling.ca so it can be counted. Let's listen to Andrew.
Let it be said that we do indeed live in interesting times, even though they may be tumultuous ones. We currently stand on the precipice of the greatest depression in written history. This is not hyperbole, it's hyperinflation. This is not exaggeration, it's stagnation. When the history books are written about this crisis, what we have gone through thus far will fit nicely in the introductory chapter. To understand the dynamics and nature of the global economic crisis that we are in, and which we have yet to face, we must first look to history and understand the dynamics of the Great Depression. As George Bernard Shaw once said, we learn from history that we learn nothing from history. First, we must understand the nature of economic crises in the capitalist system. Crises are not incidental to capitalism, but systemic. They are inherently a part of the system and functions of capitalism. Empire, war, and crisis are inherently and systematically linked. To understand the nature of their relationship, we must understand the power structure in place within the capitalist system. I am referring in large part to the central banking system. Any notions of a free market must be dispelled with, as the global economy is a managed system. What matters is whom it is managed by, and thus for whom it is free. As economist John Kenneth Galbraith wrote, the process by which banks create money is so simple that the mind is repelled. What he was referring to is the fact that money creation is simply done with the stroke of a pen, or nowadays with an entry on a computer screen. When a loan is made, it is done by simply creating new money. It does not come from a deposit, it is simply created anew. The central banking system has its origins in England. In 1694, the Bank of England was created, which is a private bank with wealthy shareholders. The bank would loan money to both the government and industry and derive profit from the interest. This is the nature of central banks. They are private institutions with private shareholders, yet have the authority and prerogative of government powers. England set the trend for central banking, and all other central banks sought to model themselves on its example. In 1907, a banking panic was instigated in the US by J.P. Morgan. Following this panic, pressure was put on the government to establish a stable banking system. In 1910, a secret meeting of financiers was held on Jekyll Island, where they planned for the creation of a National Reserve Association with 15 major regions, controlled by a board of commercial bankers but empowered by the federal government to act like a central bank, creating money and lending reserves to private banks. President Woodrow Wilson followed the plan almost exactly as it was laid out by the Wall Street bankers, except he added the creation of a Federal Reserve Board in Washington, which the president would appoint, with 12 regional reserve banks. In 1913, Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act into being. The nature of the Federal Reserve System, which remains to this day, was that real power was not with the Federal Reserve Board in Washington, but with the regional banks, and most especially the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Each regional bank is governed by a board of directors, which is elected by the member banks. The Federal Reserve, or Fed, raised its own revenue, drafted its own operating budget, and submitted neither to Congress, while the 7 governors shared power with the presidents of the 12 reserve banks, each serving the private banks in its region, which held stock shares in each of the 12 regional banks. Sir Hosea Stamp, director of the Bank of England, said in 1927, "The modern banking system manufactures money out of nothing. The process is perhaps the most astounding piece of sleight of hand that was ever invented. Banking was conceived in inequity and born in sin. Bankers own the earth. Take it away from them, but leave them the power to create money, and with the flick of a pen, they will create enough money to buy it back again. Take this great power away from them, and all great fortunes like mine will disappear, for then this would be a better and happier world to live in. But if you want to continue to be the slaves of bankers and pay the cost of your own slavery, then let bankers continue to create money and control credit. In the 1920s, a stock market boom was experienced in the United States. This was the result of commercial banks providing funds for the purchase of stocks, which created a massive wave of speculation, in which money was thrown into the stock market in anticipation of profits. A major problem with speculation was that the money was being thrown into the stock market and wasn't actually going into the production of real wealth, such as manufacturing. On September 26, 1929, London was hit with a financial panic. British money began to leave Wall Street, and the overinflated stock market began to sag. This led to a panic by mid-October in the United States. The longest-serving governor of the Federal Reserve System, Alan Greenspan, wrote in 1967, long before joining the Fed, that it was the Fed that triggered the speculative boom through its pumping excess credit into the economy. And eventually this resulted in the American and British economies collapsing due to the massive imbalances produced, thus inciting banking panics and plunging the world into the Great Depression. It was the Federal Reserve that caused the Great Depression. Through the Great Depression, the large banks became larger by their consolidation of the economy. In a depression, the ones with all the money are able to profit from the crisis, as they can buy up the economy for pennies on the dollar. In 1929, the Bank for International Settlements, or the BIS, was created. The BIS acts as a central bank to the world's central banks. It is a private institution with shareholders, but it does operations for central banks. Such operations are kept strictly confidential so that the public is usually unaware of most of the BIS operations. The apex of the system was to be the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland, a private bank owned and controlled by the world's central banks, which were themselves private corporations. It was the World War which got the United States out of the Great Depression. Following the war, Great Britain faded as an imperial power and helped facilitate the rise of the United States as the next global imperial power. The United States was thus put in charge of maintaining the international monetary system through the creation and control of the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, and the World Bank. This was a force through which the United States would expand its capital around the world, with its military force standing closely behind, ready to push the US dollar across the globe. The United States had become an engine of empire for global financial interests. The current global economic crisis must be placed in a larger context in order to understand its true nature and where it may be leading us. This crisis is not simply a failure of the neoliberal era of so-called free markets and unregulated trade and finance. This crisis is systemic to the capitalist system, and a central feature of it is the central banking system. The central banking system, being driven by profit made from interest on loans to government and industry, continually needs to print more money in order to make more on interest. Under Clinton, his Treasury Secretary Robert Rubin, who formerly worked with Goldman Sachs, the Deputy Secretary of the Treasury Lawrence Summers, former Chief Economist of the World Bank, and the Governor of the Federal Reserve Board, Alan Greenspan, all worked together to engineer the deregulation of banking and expansion of speculation. They successfully engineered the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act, which was put in place by FDR in 1933 in an effort to prevent the major banks from repeating the mistakes that led to the Great Depression. The act put a wedge between commercial banks and investment banks in an effort to prevent the creation of such behemoth banks that would engage in massive speculation. From 1987 on, Citicorp, JP Morgan, Chase Manhattan, and other major banks, many of whom were members of the Federal Reserve System, worked with Alan Greenspan at the Fed to decrease banking regulations and repeal Glass-Steagall.